rare diseases are recognized. They're also called orphan diseases for a variety of reasons. And they're generally neglected by our medical enterprise until recently. So this is changing dramatically. So it's any disease, illness, or condition that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the US, as many of you know. There's over 7,000 of these, and there's probably thousands yet to discover. We're discovering one a week, at least, across the medical enterprise. Many rare diseases, most of these rare diseases, will ultimately be rare genetic diseases that do not run in the family. They're new in the family. So I run a center that does whole genome sequencing for clinical diagnostics. We do this often for children with severe neurodevelopmental, severe muscle diseases, and they're born with this disease, but it does not run in the family. And much of the time, the discovery is a novel de novo mutation in that family, causing a profoundly different life for that child than all the other siblings and anybody else in that family's history. And this has already been known and already been recognized to be true in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is the area where I'll go into. So this rare diseases dominantly affect people starting in childhood. There's a wildly increased rate of discovery because of some of the new tools, particularly with the lower costs of whole genome sequencing. We've got ways that we need to improve those technologies to improve how we diagnose and actually make the diagnosis earlier and earlier. We currently do not diagnose until kids are affected, and we will likely move that to be younger and younger, actually including newborn screening as a sequencing test so we can cover every possible genetic disease, and then perhaps earlier still. There used to be an area of these diseases which were completely neglected by the pharmaceutical industry. We did not deal with them well in clinic, and this has actually dramatically changed. And I think many of you in this audience should probably pat yourselves on the back or go pat your senator or your congressman on the back. The legislation that enabled MD CARE Act dramatically changed funding in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It dramatically brought a set of services forward. We funded a set of centers of excellence across the United States that have had dramatic impact in Duchenne. The PDUFA reauthorization in 2012 actually was directly relevant and immediately used for approving the first ever exon skipping therapeutic in 2016 now, and a second one was approved later in 2016 for a different rare genetic disease, SMA. So these are really quite impactful legislation. It takes a while for our bureaucratic machinery to embrace them and to use them in a meaningful way, and that's part of our job, is to inform the FDA and to inform how we should and could move this forward. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy is one of the most common rare genetic diseases. It's a huge gene on the X chromosome, so mutations in it dominantly affect males. It was one of the very first genes ever positionally cloned. So when I was a pre-professor, but happily sequencing genes early in my career, this is a major story identified by a colleague of Dr. Church's at Harvard University, Lou Kunkel, in 1986. There was an immediate enthusiasm over the years coming forward as the disease was actually figured out. There were multiple models that were considered for Duchenne, and indeed it ends up being that this protein that's missing is very large. It acts like a shock absorber, connecting the muscle machinery inside your muscle through the muscle membrane to the extracellular matrix, and without it, your muscles are repeatedly damaged with every single contraction, resulting in your muscles being replaced by fat and fibrosis over your lifetime, and every single muscle in the body is affected, which is a dramatically difficult disease. So we know a lot about Duchenne because it is one of the relatively more common rare diseases. About 1 in 5,000 male births result in a child with Duchenne. 2/3 of all of our families have it for the first time in their family. Only 1/3 have any family history of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's by far and away the most common muscular dystrophy and one of the most severe. Eventually, everybody progresses and they have severe muscle weakness and ultimately succumb to respiratory and cardiac failure. It's estimated that there's about 10 to 15,000 patients living in the United States at any one time. This is what brought me into the Duchenne field. Sorry, sometimes my voice breaks even 15 years later. This is my son on the left, the blonde-haired little boy, and he's with his cousin. So this is his cousin who's just a couple months, This doesn't always happen to me. I'm sorry for that. And when he was 2, he was clearly deviating off of motor milestones, things that parents would typically worry about. He wasn't walking early. He wasn't talking as clearly. And these ultimately ended up being signs of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So a year later, after substantial concerns, he was solved with one of the most common rare genetic diseases, Duchenne, and we could watch him develop and change relative to his able-bodied cousin. His able-bodied cousin, those are both taken on Mother's Day. Sorry about that. Last week, where Dylan is now using a wheelchair full-time, his cousin is heading off to play volleyball at Long Beach State, which is the current NCAA champions. So they're heading in wildly different, sorry about this. They're heading in wildly different directions. Dylan can't tie his own shoes, he can't comb his own hair, he can't bring a glass of water to his face. But as you can see, he's still very engaged. There's still a lot of energy left in him, and he's tried to make an impact, partly because of Dylan's diagnosis and partly because of what we could bring and brought forward to us of the severe need. Dylan's mother, Carrie Michelli, who's also a professor at UCLA of immunology, and I formed the Center for Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy at UCLA. We wanted to greatly change what care was being delivered in our world. We wanted to change how clinical trials were available and how they were implemented and how quickly they could move forward. And we also wanted to empower new research work at UCLA that works with researchers around the world. So all this exists at UCLA now. We're thrilled. Organizations like Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, MDA, have done an amazing job of actually pushing forward the therapeutic agenda. There's over 30 companies working in just the Duchenne space alone. And again, these are thanks to legislation that makes rare disease work more easy and more possible to actually fund by insurance companies. So many of these clinical trials are now ongoing at UCLA or across the world, and there's substantial new hope. Dylan himself has participated in clinical trials since he was 6 years old, so he is an old soul. He's a real trooper. But even with all of his participation in multiple clinical trials, his disease has progressed. It's indicated in the green and red in MRI of his thigh, where red muscle has been steadily replaced by fat and fibrosis, which is indicated in green, and that can be false colored on these MRI images. And that just sort of brings to life the disease in a very apparent way that we can look at inside the body now. So these rare genetic diseases, and part of how I describe them, I think each of us lives in a different component of this world, are leading the way for how we're bringing precision medicines forward. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy is the first muscle disease and the first disease that used RNA modification of exon splicing. So an exon skipping drug was approved in 2016 after about 15 years of work on that enterprise. A second drug for spinal muscular atrophy was FDA approved, and these are now both available in clinic. I just diagnosed an 18-month-old baby with an exon 51 skippable mutation. That child is going to get on this drug called eteplirsen early, and we'll be on that lifelong until there's better therapies. This is a dramatically different world than the one Dylan entered into, and we're thankful for that. There's a wild and very optimistic world that is emerging, as Dr. Church had mentioned, that's replacing the missing gene is now plausible. We have decent delivery systems, so AAV, adeno-associated virus, can deliver the gene package as long as the gene is small enough into muscle or into nerves and affect a cure of the disease in theory, right? It might just be a treatment. It might need to be repeatedly done, but those are on the cusp now. There's actually 3 different companies in clinical stage in Duchenne at this moment, and we'll learn and see how those data look in the coming years. So I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes reflecting at the end of this on the multiple hats that I wear in this space. So I'm a parent, and as a parent, I'm very concerned about Dylan participating in these clinical trials. I deal with the other parents that come to me for care and for advice, and there's a lot of anxiety. There's 30 different clinical trials at UCLA alone. How do you choose what clinical trial you're going to participate in? How do you know how to move forward? How do you know if you participate in one trial, like gene therapy, that you might be excluded from every other clinical trial? So it's not without some consequences as we move forward, but we can and do keep moving forward with vigor. We all have terrible experiences with health insurance if you have a rare disease. You can't go to any patient anywhere in this room, if you know anybody with serious rare disease, and have a great health insurance story. It just doesn't exist in our country. So we need to fix that. So I can give you multiple different stories on this issue, but I'll just take one that's not gene therapy oriented. My son needs a power wheelchair. Simple, right? He can't walk. There's simple power wheelchairs. He also gets contractures and his ankles will get tight, his hips will get tight. He's sitting all day long. Could you make a power wheelchair that actually stands up and alleviates that for him? Yeah, people have actually made these. Can health insurance companies deny kids that equipment? Yes, we permit them to do that. Was Dylan denied? He was. My physician and I had to write 3 different letters of appeal, spend multiple times on the phone, gather the relevant literature for one child's wheelchair that's appropriate. It was denied 3 separate times, ultimately got awarded on external appeal, but the amount of time, of waste of energy that I spent, my physician spent, the durable medical equipment provider spent, and Dylan didn't have a wheelchair for a year, that was the appropriate thing for him. That's a wrong system. I would ask you to look at ways that you could help solve those issues for us, and it's generic across the rare disease space. From my physician perspective, we impose enormous burdens on these physicians who are willing to work in this area. They come, they work in a rare disease area. They often have to give information about these diseases are not currently curable. There is a progression. The disease is going to change. It's only going to change for the worse. And here's how we're going to deal with that. But we do not fund them appropriately. We don't give them all the tools they need. We don't fund how they can care for the patients. We're going to now ask them to record standardized information so that as new genetic therapies come forward, we'll know that they work. We're going to add to their clinical burden in that. We need to make sure that people who work in this rare disease space have the resources to give our kids care and our adults care in this space in a compassionate, coordinated way that's right for them. And again, that's a bit broken right now. I think we could do better. And then from the scientist's perspective, we're on the cusp of great things. It's really quite exciting. We really have genomic medicines in sight, but we need to keep investing in that NIH portfolio that actually bring all of these forward. It is the engine that drives all of this creativity. As George Church was mentioning, there's a massive amount of NIH grants all underlie every discovery that we're looking at this point. I just want to thank you for your attention.